Hi, my name is Stephanie Brennan. I am with Quilt Addicts Anonymous, and we are continuing our series on making garments with quilting fabric. So in this video, we're actually going to take the measurements that we took in the first video and then translated them to cutting measurements in the second video, and we're actually going to measure the fabric and cut it out. So when we are cutting out fabric for garments, there's a couple things that you really need to keep in mind that you don't really need to worry about as much when we're quilting. First and foremost is the fabric's grain line. Now the grain line is how the fabric was woven, and that is going to affect how the fabric falls on the body and how it just kind of lays and how it behaves. When finding a grain, the best thing to do is to look for the selvage here. So the selvage is going to be exactly where that grain lies. So you want to, on your pattern measurements, there's always going to be a big arrow or a big line that shows you where the grain is. You want that to be parallel to this. Now in this skirt, since there's not a pattern per se that we're going to use like you would with templates, we're just going to cut out rectangles. We're still going to follow this along and make sure that our ruler, that everything lines up with this. Now, one thing to keep in mind with this fabric, there's a very directional print on here. We've got, fans that are pointing up, and they're also in very horizontal rows. So with this being a very, very forgiving skirt, if we're a little bit off grain, it's going to be okay because there's going to be enough fullness to kind of cover that up. We're not going to see the skirt kind of falling in any kind of a wonky direction. And you can also see the grain line if you have your fabric folded selvage to selvage very carefully. The grain line is also going to be here on this fold. So I'm going to show you actually two ways that you can cut this. Normally, I would go ahead and cut the skirt here on the fold because everything's going to be nice and centered. It's easy, one nice cut. There you go. With this one, we're actually going to unfold it because we really want to make sure that these fans are running straight on there, especially along the bottom with the hem, because that's where it's really going to be obvious if things are crooked and not exactly straight. Now you can cut the fabric with shears or with a rotary cutter, whichever you're going to be more comfortable with. For garment sewing, I usually prefer to use shears, but since this is just a bunch of straight lines, we're going to just use a rotary cutter and be done with it. All right, so we're actually going to get started cutting. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is very familiar to probably most quilters. We're going to clean up this edge here. Again, to keep the pattern straight, I'm actually looking at the top of these fans and I'm lining up one of the lines on the ruler with the top of those fans. Now, it's the way that it worked out, it's actually pretty darn close to being perfectly on grain. So this one was printed pretty close, pretty straight, but not all fabrics are gonna do that. So just really be careful with it. All right, so what we're gonna do from here, we have the top of our skirt cut out. We have a nice clean cut. Now we're gonna measure down the length, which is 23.5 inches for this particular skirt. What I'm gonna do, because instead of cutting this while folded, because we want to make sure that these fans are nice and straight, I'm going to measure it from the top to the center and I'm going to mark it. And in this case, I'm just going to use this chalk pencil because this is a pretty dark piece of fabric. Now you can use anything because the bottom of the skirt is actually going to be folded up in the hem. So maybe not anything. I wouldn't use like a Sharpie or anything, but a pencil, you can use a light pen, you can use a chalk pencil like this. You could even use straight pens. Whatever you want to use to just make sure you know where you want to cut on here. Now, if you were doing this where the print with the directional print was not such a concern, you can just measure down, mark where it is, take your ruler and line it up and just cut. But we're not going to do that in this case because this is a little bit more complicated, but it's still not too bad. So we have 23.5. So I'm just measuring that here at the end of the ruler. And if your length is longer than this, you can use a tape measure, you can use your mat, whatever you want to use to measure it. And since I do have to measure this one layer at a time, I am going to mark it in a couple different places so I can make sure to line it up as closely as I can. So what I'm doing now, I have my two marks here, and I'm just lining up my ruler so I have a straight line between them. And I'm also making sure that the fans here also line up with one of the marks on the ruler. Now I'm going to open it up and continue it on the other side. All right, so now instead of using the chalk pencil that I was using, I'm actually switching to the black friction pen just because I can see the chalk on here, when I look really closely, but it's really hard to show it on camera. So just to make sure that you can see it and you know what we're looking for, we're going to switch to this pen that's a little easier to see. So I'm just finding the line that I drew previously, and it looks like here the print is kind of starting to go sideways just a little tiny bit. So I'm going to keep it as close as I possibly can to the grain line, because this does mean that the hem on the skirt isn't going to be perfectly straight, but it's a gathered skirt. You're going to see the print a lot more than you see the actual hem. So now that I've marked where the bottom cutting line is, I'm going to go ahead and cut this out. I don't know how well you can see this, but we just have a line right here. It lines up with the top or very close to the top of these fans, and that's going to be the bottom of our skirt. Now that we have the length of our skirt cut out, we can just measure out the width, and we can cut what will be the side seam. Now the final measurement for this skirt was going to be 37.25. That divided in half was 18 5/8. I like easy numbers, so I'm just going to round that up to 18 3/4. Just going to put a mark so that I can line up my ruler. And this is going to be inside of a French seam, so I'm worried about whether I can see the mark. I'm really not worried about whether the mark is going to show up once the skirt is done. All right, so we are done cutting the outside of this. So if you are doing a lining, go ahead and do this exact same thing on your lining. In the next video, what we're going to do is we're actually going to start sewing it together. We're going to sew the side seam together with a French seam, which might sound a little intimidating, but I promise you it's not. It's a really great way to give it a nice professional finish on your home sewing machine without a serger or anything like that. One other thing that I would do, since we worked so hard to make sure that this was straight, that we have that the pattern is going to look nice, go ahead and mark the top and the bottom of your skirt. Because if you're anything like me, you kind of get wrapped up in things and get carried away and can make silly mistakes. And then you have upside down fans instead of nice pretty ones that are facing up. So make sure that you have your top and your bottom marked. Make sure you're following along with your printable from shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com. And we will see you in the next one. Happy quilting and garment sewing.